Hello, welcome to Endemic Times. My name is Amira. The Texas House of Representatives recently released their preliminary report on the Uvalde shooting that took place at Robb Elementary School on May 24th of this year that took the lives of 19 children and 2 teachers. This has been discussed on a lot of mainstream news outlets, but there has been some other key areas within this report that I found very telling, very concerning, that I wanted to dive into a little bit more and bring this information to you. This report went into a lot of the inner workings of both the school, its administration, as well as the police department and its administration. So please stick around because I think there's a lot of information here you haven't seen before. And please remember to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell. And let me know your thoughts on this down in the comments below. I'd really like to get a feel for how people are thinking about this shooting because there's a lot of different opinions when it comes to gun control, schools, teachers with guns, and things like that. So without much further ado, let's get into it. Other than the attacker, the committee did not find any villains in the course of its investigation. There is no one to whom we can attribute malice or ill motives. Instead, we found systemic failures and egregiously poor decision-making. We recognize that the impact of this tragedy is felt most profoundly by the people of Uvalde in ways we cannot fully comprehend. With hindsight, we can say that Robb Elementary did not adequately prepare for the risk of an armed intruder on campus. The school's 5-foot-tall exterior fence was inadequate to meaningfully impede an intruder. While the school has adopted security policies to lock exterior doors and internal classroom doors, there was a regrettable culture of non-compliance by school personnel who frequently propped doors open and deliberately circumvented locks. So this was one of the very first pieces of information that the police decided to disseminate to the public when it came to how did this event even occur. We were told that a rock had been used to prop one of those doors open, but this was refuted by the teacher that claimed that there was no rock and that video surveillance actually showed her kicking the rock away and she closed the door shut. I found this very interesting that they went to this extent in this report. They actually spent a good deal of time on the school and then they moved on to the police station. It was almost the same amount of pages worth that discussed the school and then the police. And this was one of these areas in this report where it's talking about the school and the just general activities and conduct of these teachers and classrooms, how they operated and things like that. At a minimum, school administrators and school district police tacitly condoned this behavior as they were aware of these unsafe practices and did not treat them as serious infractions requiring immediate correction. In fact, the school actually suggested circumventing the locks as a solution for the convenience of substitute teachers and others who lacked their own keys. The school district did not treat the maintenance of doors and locks with appropriate urgency. In particular, staff and students widely knew the door to one of the victimized classrooms, Room 111, was ordinarily unsecured and accessible. Room 111 could be locked, but an extra effort was required to make sure the latch engaged. Many knew Room 111's door had a faulty lock, and school district police had specifically warned the teacher about it. The problem with locking the door had been reported to school administration, yet no one placed a written work order for a repair. That's one of the most common themes within this report, is that the bureaucratic micromanagement and also just organizational structure of this school district really impeded teachers to keep their classrooms safe, because it wasn't the lack of teachers informing administrators that there were issues with the doors and that there were issues with other things like the Wi-Fi, getting alerts from the different apps that teachers and students had. There was a systemic failure, but I felt that it was important to note this, that this wasn't because teachers were not taking this seriously. They were informing the school district and administrators of these issues with these doors, and it was the school administration that failed to act. Other factors delayed the reporting of the threat to the campus and to law enforcement. Low quality internet service, poor mobile phone coverage, and varying habits of mobile phone usage at the school all led to inconsistent receipt of the lockdown notice by teachers. If the alert had reached more teachers sooner, it is likely that more could have been done to protect them and their students. And that's where I really had some issues with this report, which was mostly mostly just in the tone of the writing. I completely understand that they are having to be very objective and that they're also having to look at this from a very broad spectrum. But I think that bringing up things like low quality internet and a lack of mobile phone service is one of those aspects where the teachers and possibly even the school administration doesn't have a lot of control over that in particular. And we kind of all know how these bureaucratic systems love to work, which is that they don't really work. There's a lot of compartmentalization within these structures. A school administration is still very much like a corporation, and the way that it's designed with these different levels of hierarchy and who has last say and control and management over teachers, substitute teachers, handymen, and things like that. This just seemed like a very odd thing to put in the report, but again, I think this is them just having to be very broad and kind of give a base of what the issues were that they're thinking caused this, rather than just kind of being like, yeah, this was primarily the cop's fault, and we're going to get more into that. In violation of school policy, no one had locked any of the 3 exterior doors to the west building of Robb Elementary. As a result, the attacker had unimpeded access to enter. Once inside, the attacker continued into the adjoining rooms 111 and 112, probably through the door to room 111, and apparently completely unimpeded. Locking the exterior and interior doors ultimately may not have been enough to stop the attacker from entering the building and classrooms, but had school personnel locked the doors as the school's policy required, that could have slowed his progress for a few precious minutes, long enough to review alerts, hide children, and lock doors, and long enough to give police more opportunity to engage and stop the attacker before he could massacre 19 students and 2 teachers. Long enough to give police more opportunity to engage. Now, let's just remember back to where this all started. The shooter of this shot his grandmother in the face, got into a vehicle, crashed that vehicle into a ditch, walked through a parking lot that was observed by several people that even tried to engage with the shooter, to no avail. It's just very baffling to me that they think that all of these things would have given the police more time to engage when the police did have a lot of time to engage before he even really entered into the school. It's one of those things where it just begs the question, where was everyone? Because there had been a 911 call prior to him getting to the school, and then as he got to the school. So 911 operators were aware of what was going on. And in previous reports, it was said that the teacher had pushed the rock and closed the door immediately. It's one of those times where when trying to be objective and trying to have a balance of fault, they're finding things that you could say are partly the reason why this happened, but not really. Not in this circumstance. It was not because of low Wi-Fi that officers failed to act for 70 minutes. It just really seems like schools and teachers and students are having to do a whole hell of a lot, while the police, who this is their job, this is what they sign up for, this is what they train for, this is what these officers did train for. It just seems like they're putting a lot of responsibility on the school, on the teachers, on the students, and not as much on the police. Now, it's not to say that they do not discuss the police and their absolute ineptitude at times, but maybe that's just me. I don't know. Let me know down in the comments below if you check out this article or just kind of what you see here, what you think, because this is my perception, but maybe I'm wrong. I'm open to being wrong. So let me know down in the comments below. Because of these failures of facilities maintenance and advanced preparation, the attacker fired most of his shots and likely murdered most of his innocent victims before any responder set foot in the building. Of the approximately 142 rounds the attacker fired inside the building, it is almost certain that he rapidly fired over 100 of those rounds before any officer entered. So while this wasn't everything that they talked about when it came to the school, these were some of the big key points that I saw that I just felt were important to discuss. It really felt to me in this report that they were trying to kind of lay down some groundwork of possible issues that you could find with the school in order to kind of blanket the police with a very tiny bit, a very little veneer of protection. But I really do think that in the court of public opinion, a lot of people are pretty much just no, this was an abject failure by the police and the police alone. I'm definitely in that camp. Let me know what you think. This next section went into talking about the responders, so the people that responded to these calls and that ended up being at the scene of the shooting. At Robb Elementary, law enforcement responders failed to adhere to their active shooter training, and they failed to prioritize saving the lives of innocent victims over their own safety. The first wave of responders to arrive included the chief of the school district police and the commander of the Uvalde Police Department SWAT team. Despite the immediate presence of local law enforcement leaders, there was an unacceptably long period of time before officers breached the classroom, neutralized the attacker, and began rescue efforts. We do not know at this time whether responders could have saved more lives by shortening that delay. The Uvalde CISD's written active shooter plan directed its police chief to assume command and control the response of an active shooter. The chief of police was one of the first responders on the scene, but as events unfolded, he failed to perform or to transfer to another person the role of incident commander. This was an essential duty he had assigned to himself in the plan mentioned above, yet it was not effectively performed by anyone. In this report, they actually do have a full detail of the active shooter plan. For me personally, I felt like it was pretty slim, but it does have some very specific key things, and one of those being that the chief of police was going to be the one that would be in command at the scene unless he was to transfer it to someone else. And we do know that Chief Arredondo was the one to arrive on scene. At that time that he arrived, he was the highest in command and was essentially in that role of command, but he still acts like he wasn't. The void of leadership could have contributed to the loss of life as injured victims waited for over an hour for help, and the attacker continued to sporadically fire his weapon. Nobody ensured that responders making key decisions inside the building received information that students and teachers had survived the initial burst of gunfire, were trapped in rooms 111 and 112, and had called out for help. Some responders outside and inside the building knew that information through radio communications, but nobody in command analyze this information to recognize that the attacker was preventing critically injured victims from obtaining medical care. Recognition of an active shooter scenario also should have prompted responders to prioritize the rescue of innocent victims over the precious time wasted in search for door keys and shields to enhance the safety of law enforcement responders. Uvalde CISD and its police department failed to implement their active shooter plan and failed to exercise command and control of law enforcement responding to the tragedy. But these local officials were not the only ones expected to supply the leadership needed during this tragedy. Hundreds of responders from numerous law enforcement agencies, many of whom were better trained and better equipped than the school district police, quickly arrived on the scene. Those other responders who also had received training on active shooter response and the interrelation of law enforcement agencies could have helped to address the unfolding chaos. It's one of those things though. You're asking people to stand up and speak up in an environment and in a organization that pretty much requires you to kind of take the demands you're given. You're given orders and you're expected to follow those orders, which as this report goes on, it does seem like they're kind of not recognizing how these institutions work and the way that these hierarchies are and the just kind of overall management of people and what they're expected or not expected to do in certain situations. Yet in this crisis, no responder seized the initiative to establish an incident command post. Despite an obvious atmosphere of chaos, the ranking officers of other responding agencies did not approach the Uvalde CISD chief of police or anyone else perceived to be in command to point out the lack of and need for a command post or to offer that specific assistance. This suggests a training deficiency in that responding officers failed to adequately question the absence of command. Other responders failed to be sufficiently assertive by identifying the incident commander and offering their assistance or guidance, or by assuming command in the absence of any other responder having expressly done so. In this sense, the entirety of law enforcement and its training, preparation, and response shares systemic responsibility for many missed opportunities on that tragic day. Like we've been given any semblance that police officers are not going to just follow the orders that they are given. That is their job. That is their role. It is not to question authority. The whole point of police officers is that they follow the rules that they are given. If they don't follow the rules, they're usually kicked out. If they don't agree with what's being done, they get removed from the scene, as we saw here. Officer Ruiz, whose wife was one of those teachers that ultimately died, was informed within 13 minutes of them being on site that she had been shot, which he also informed his fellow officers. And they detained him. They removed him from the scene. He was willing to go in. He had his gun, but he was pulled back. Now, there are some people that look at that video and say, I would have put put forward a lot more energy to get past these officers and gone through that door. While I somewhat agree, I do think that the way that Officer Ruiz was so quick to be removed from the scene it does kind of make you think, but it's one of those things where we are not personally in that situation. We do not know for sure how we would personally act, but the fact that there was an officer who had his gun and who was willing to go in is something that this report doesn't really talk about. They don't talk about the fact that they did have an officer that was willing to go against the instructions that he was being given. Yet in this report, and not just in this section, it's pretty much the overall tone of this entire report. They have this expectation that officers are going to question what's happening around them and be so sure of themselves that they can go up to a fellow officer or even one that's possibly higher in rank and be like, hey, what's going on here? I'm going to take command. That just seems ridiculous to me. That is an unrealistic expectation to have of police that we know are in there to take orders. They take the demands that they are given and they enforce those orders. To act like they can do anything other than take the demands given to them by their higher up officer just boggles my mind, because it seems like this House of Representatives doing this investigation are just kind of detached from reality of how these bureaucratic systems work, because you're not supposed to question authority. This next part of the report looked at Uvalde CISD Police Department specifically. They have 9 different schools and they have a budget for 6 police officers. Uvalde CISD oversees more campuses than it has officers and has no assigned officer specifically to Robb Elementary. Instead, officers would regularly visit Robb Elementary School and basically do a walk around for about 15 to 45 minutes. When they would visit those campuses, they would go around, rattle doors, and check that they were locked. Uvalde CISD police officers commonly carried 2 radios, one for the school district and another police radio which transmitted communications from various law enforcement agencies. While the school district radios tended to work reliably, the police radios worked more intermittently depending on where they were used. So this is by far one of the most frustrating areas of this report to me personally, because they spent a good page and a half talking about all of these failures of the school itself, from the fence to low Wi-Fi, mobile phone usage not being very good, but they spend no time on the fact that these officers had 2 radios when they would go to Robb Elementary School, and they never reported that their radios did not sufficiently work when they were on the campus. So my question is, why in this report do they not have a bit of questioning of the officers? Why didn't they report this? Why didn't they get better radios that would actually work when they were on the campus? They spent so much time pointing a finger at the school on things that, when you look at the active shooter plan and what the necessary requirements are for the school to have in place, the school had pretty much everything in place. They had a good fence. It wasn't that that fence was bad, but in this report, they're trying to act like it wasn't that good of a fence, even though it met the standards of their active shooter plan. And this is one of those things. This is an institution of learning. This is not somewhere that teachers and students should have to be in this much mind all of the time of, could an active shooter possibly come onto our campus? That is the police officer's job. And here, it's so obvious that they failed at their job before this shooting ever even happened. They knew that their radios were not working correctly, and they did nothing to fix that issue. So why isn't that in this report? Why don't they talk about that? Why don't they point that finger to these police officers that they failed, incredibly so, by not reporting that their radios did not work, yet everyone seemed to understand that they didn't function properly prior to the shooting. So they got on teachers and the school district for knowing about a door that was not well enough to actually close and lock without a severe exertion of force. They sure make a point to judge and bring that up, but not about these police officers and their radios. I don't know about you, but it just kind of pisses me off. And they expressly say in this report that in the event of an active shooter incident, the policy expressly provided that upon verification of an active shooter, the district police department chief will become the person in control of the efforts of all law enforcement and first responders that arrive at the scene. So this means that Arredondo knew he was the one in command. This is another lie that we have been given to obfuscate, to try to lessen the blame on himself. But I still want to know who he says or who he believes in his head was the one that was in charge. It doesn't seem like they pressed him on that in this investigation, but because a lot of this was behind closed doors, we're really never going to know. Before joining the Uvalde CISD Police Department, Chief Arredondo received active shooter training from the Alert Center, which the FBI has recognized as the national standard in active shooter response training. So it's one of those things where he says he's not in command, but he has been in the most recognized national standard in active shooter training, but didn't believe that he was in command. I have lots of questions. After Columbine, while protecting the lives of officers remained a high priority, stopping the killing of innocent civilians took first priority. From that moment forward, every law enforcement officer was expected to be willing to risk his or her life without hesitation. Law enforcement officers were expected to distract, isolate, and neutralize the threat, even in tacitly complex situations when they lacked special training. And this is a sample of the active shooter response card that they had in this report. This was the best resolution that I could get, but it talks about the first to arrive, then once sufficient contact teams have made entry, and then establishing a reunification center. As more responders arrive on the scene, someone should assume command outside of the building. This person could be of a high-ranking officer or any responder who sees enough personnel are inside and realizes that things need to be taken care of on the outside of the building. And this, again, just really doesn't square with the fact that Officer Ruiz, who was willing to act, got removed from the scene. If anything, I think that probably displayed to other officers that they needed to stay in line and follow the orders that they were being given. Now, granted, on the outside, things were a lot different, but they were detaining parents and other good Samaritans that actually gave a crap, that wanted to go in and save their children, regardless of the risk to themselves. Police are very similar to the military, and the way that they are designed, the way that this organization looks, is that police officers are supposed to take the instruction that they are given from their commanding officer. There's somewhat of that aspect of like groupthink. And this is also a club, and a lot of them are not going to want to hinder their placement in this club. Again, it feels like in this report, the tone and just kind of overall understanding of the way that our systems work when it comes to the police, and also when it comes to the school district, but especially when it comes to the police, there just seems to be a bit of a disconnect from how things work, how things should work, how we want them to work, and then how they ultimately work out. And as we're seeing across the country, there's just a lot of ineptitude when it comes to police officers and police departments, their ability to act effectively, their ability to, not shoot innocent kids that ran a stop sign because, they're scared. They don't deserve to get shot over 100 times. They exert so much force in times when it's not needed, and in times like this, when they should have just done whatever was needed, they don't do anything. Later on in this report, they kind of go back again to the locking of the doors, or the failure to lock these doors. And they say that Robb Elementary's principal testified that the school's west building has 3 exterior doors, 2 of which policy required to remain locked. Each classroom in the west building had a door to a hallway, which policy required to remain locked at all times. The interior doors were solid metal with a small pane of glass and could only be locked from the outside using a key. Multiple witnesses reported to the committee that people at Robb Elementary commonly left doors unlocked, as did people at all the other Uvalde CISD schools as well. Teachers would use rocks to prop open exterior doors, and they used door stops, wedges, and magnets to prevent interior door locks from latching. Due to a key shortage, Robb Elementary School substitute teachers often were instructed to use the magnet system to circumvent the locks in violation of school district policy. And this is where the narrative that they are putting here it really bothers me. Because if you've ever been on a school campus, you know that these heavy auto-locking doors that are required to be locked at all times are exceedingly difficult. And especially when you're bringing in supplies, and on specifically this day, there was an award ceremony that was going on. So there were a lot of teachers and a lot of parents and a lot of students going back and forth. Again, this is an institution for learning. This is not somewhere that they should have to be this much on guard all of the time. The fact that they had a shortage of keys just kind of says a lot about the atmosphere that these teachers were probably having to deal with. They were likely having to take care of a lot of these things themselves because they're telling administrators the issues and they're not placing the work orders like they should. So while you can say that it was not a safe practice, the onus still lies on the police, because that is their job. that is their role. It's not like Robb Elementary School had nothing in place when it came to an active shooter. And it's not like they didn't do everything that they could that day to keep as many students safe as possible. The fault does truly lie, in my opinion, on these officers, their inability to act effectively and in a timely manner. That should be the crux of this, not let's look at the doors, let's look at the lack of keys, let's look at how can we obfuscate some of the blame from the police officers onto the school district. Now, I will say that I do believe that the school administration has a lot to answer for. But when it comes to teachers and substitute teachers and students, this is just not something that they should have to be worrying about. They should be able to move freely and openly and go back and forth the way that they need to. And if they don't have enough keys, they should get keys. Why weren't there keys? Is it because they don't have it in their budget? And if they don't have it in their budget, it's one of those things where kind of give us the receipts. Why does this school not have enough money to fix locks and get keys taken care of? Because if you don't have the money for that, then you better not be giving people bonuses. You better not be sending people to these off-site trainings that kind of do really nothing for people on the ground. It doesn't do anything for the teachers. It doesn't do anything for the students. And it sure as hell doesn't protect them during an active shooter situation. So that's another area where I'd like to see their budget and how they can justify not having enough keys on site for teachers and students. Just makes you go, Uvalde CISD police officer Adrian Gonzalez testified that when an officer was walking the floors and checking doors, the teachers would notify each other and they would lock their doors. The officers would speak to the teachers and to their supervisors, and they tried to discourage the use of magnets. Common responses from teachers would include that they did not have a key, particularly in the case of substitute teachers, and that it was just temporary while using the restroom. At the time of the incident, all the doors in the building had been recently painted. In March 2022, around spring break, school administrators received a report from the teacher in room 111 that his classroom door was not always locking. According to numerous witnesses who testified before the committee, the door to room 111 could lock, although it took some extra effort, and if the door closed softly, it might not lock. But the head custodian at Robb Elementary testified that he never heard about any problems with the doors for rooms 111 or 112, and if he had, he would have created a work order. So again, it's not on the teacher for not having his door properly maintained. Numerous people informed the school district, informed the administrators that they needed to repair this. So they have money to paint the doors, but they don't have money for extra keys and to put in a work order and pay to get a new kind of lock on this door because it's not working. It's one of those things where every organization, every corporation, every business, and even these types of systems, when it comes to schools and when it comes to police, there are roles and responsibilities in place. Different people have different roles and responsibilities. These teachers have no control over placing work orders. They can only tell school administrators so many times. It's up to the administrators to effectively act on that information that they're being given. It does bother me that they had the time and the money to paint the doors rather than make sure that all of the doors are functioning first, but that's just me. Robb Elementary teachers testified to the committee that instead of requesting a work order themselves, they would call school administrators who were responsible for making the requests. And this is one of those things where they only give certain people the power to make these kinds of requests because they want it to go through the bureaucratic red tape that we all know and probably despise. If this report had detailed more of that, had more of that kind of energy when it came to talking about the school and pointing the blame a lot more at the administration of the school rather than the actions of teachers and students, I could understand a lot more. We all know that there's this general way of doing things and then ultimately how things go. And with schools, you have to be pretty fluid. You have to be able to kind of ascertain the situation and do that little bit of mental gymnastics of, is it worth it just kind of propping this door open for the 10 minutes I need to go to my car and bring stuff in, or wait for more red tape, more bureaucracy, all of the areas that they could have focused a lot of stringent review. I just don't feel that this was fair. But let me know down in the comments below what you think. Considering the district's policies about keeping doors locked, it was important that doors and locks be properly maintained. The manufacturer discontinued production of the door locks used at Robb Elementary. While the school district had acquired a supply of key blanks at the time the locks were purchased, that supply was gone by May 2022. The director of maintenance and operations, Mr. Harrison, testified that people frequently lose, forget, or simply do not want to carry school keys. As a result, the custodians spend a lot of time opening doors. The maintenance and operations department has one employee who specializes in door repairs, but it relies on YouTube instruction videos, online diagrams, and the help of a local locksmith to work on locks. Harrison testified that unless there is a work order notifying his department of a problem, his employees do not regularly check doors. So let's think about this. You have a maintenance and operations department with one employee who specializes in door repairs, and that person has to rely on YouTube instruction videos. Now, I have no beef with this person because I've been there. I know what it's like to not have really any help and you're having to just kind of figure things out on your own and you have to rely on instruction videos on YouTube. But it's one of those things where it begs the question, what is this school administration spending their good money on? Because if it's not on the teachers' salaries, keeping their facilities safe, and making sure that work orders are being processed and put through to keep that maintenance and safety of the school, then where is this money going? Both Uvalde CISD Police Chief Arredondo and Lieutenant Mike Hernandez possessed a large number of keys to Uvalde CISD buildings. Chief Arredondo kept a number of keys in his car, but he was not sure whether he had master keys for Robb Elementary. He knew he did not have a key to every building, though he testified that he had requested a complete set for himself. Arnulfo Ruiz, the 4th grade teacher in room 111, stated in an interview that the teachers and students in his building widely knew that the door to his classroom frequently did not lock, and he had gotten in trouble several times when Uvalde CISD police officers found the door unlocked. He stated that on multiple occasions, he reported the malfunctioning lock to school administrators who stated that the request had been turned in. So this is one of those things the teacher reported on multiple occasions to the school district that he had a malfunctioning lock on his door. The police officers knew he had a malfunctioning lock on his door to the point where he's getting in trouble with the police officers. But the fact is that he did what was expected of him. He informed his higher up. It was his higher up that didn't take any action on this and was essentially lied to when they said that the request had been turned in because the maintenance facility said that they didn't receive a work order. And they actually never did find, to my knowledge, a written work order for this lock. So it begs the question, who was the person that was informed? Why did they fail to act? And why is it only 1 or 2 people that can place these work orders? Because they are not the person that's in that classroom day in and day out. They do not know the specifics going on and what the needs are of those classrooms, which kind of makes me wonder, is that why teachers aren't allowed to place the work orders? Because they know, possibly, that they have all of these faulty issues going on with the school, and rather than pay to get them taken care of, they're just trying to put things off and put things off. And now this school is being completely torn down. I'm filled with so many questions. As was the apparent practice among Robb Elementary teachers, Reyes never submitted a work order to repair the door lock for room 111 himself. Principal Gutierrez, in her testimony, confirmed that school administration knew about the issues with the door, stating that it was reported around spring break of 2022. So many people knew of this issue, though. So it really does beg the question, how long had this door not been sufficiently maintained? Because it doesn't seem like it was something that just out of the blue happened in May or early this year. This seems like a systemic issue that this teacher was having to experience with his door. And again, he informed his administrators to the best that he could. He doesn't have the power to place these work orders. The people that do didn't. So this report goes into a lot of detail about the shooter, his mental state, his history, and the events leading up to the shooting. I'm not going to cover that in this video. If you'd like to see me cover that, then let me know down in the comments below. But for now, I am truly just trying to focus on the particulars within this report that I found very concerning and shedding a lot of light onto these bureaucratic structures that, because of that bureaucracy, are pretty much why there was this widespread systemic failure. And then they go on into talking about some of the specifics of that day, kind of starting right as Arredondo came onto the campus. And I wanted to bring just a little bit of that to you. Just minutes before, Chief Arredondo had been in his office at Uvalde High School when he heard shots fired on the radio. He rushed out, heard something about Robb Elementary School, and drove toward the school. He arrived with his radios, but as he exited the vehicle, he was fumbling with them and they bothered him. So he dropped them by the school fence, knowing that Sergeant Coronado, the sergeant on patrol, was there and fully uniformed with his radio. Principal Mandy Gutierrez had just finished an award ceremony and was in her office when she heard Coach Silva's report over the radio. She attempted to initiate a lockdown on the Raptor application, but she had difficulty making the alert because of a bad Wi-Fi signal. She did not attempt to communicate the lockdown alert over the school's intercom. By phone, she called and spoke with Chief Arredondo, who told her, "Shut it down, Mandy. shut it down. That's another thing that's mentioned in this report was this Raptor application. You can see the details of that in this report. They do cover a lot of that and how there was a lot of failures with that application because of this bad mobile phone and Wi-Fi signal that was on the campus itself. There is so much in this report that goes into the specific details of the shooting, looking at the students and the teachers and where they were, what classrooms they took cover in, and things like that. If you're interested in seeing more detailed coverage on that, let me know down in the comments below. Chief Arredondo and other officers contended that they were justified in treating the attacker as a barricaded subject rather than an active shooter because of lack of visual confirmation of injuries or other information. This is another piece of information I just kind of can't quite wrap my head around, especially because it was Officer Ruiz within that 13-15 minute mark into the time of the shooting that was ready to go in, that knew that his wife had been injured, and there were also other first responders that knew that there were injuries going on. So while Chief Arredondo can say he didn't know, I still, in my heart of hearts, believe that he did know. I just think he did not know what he was doing, even though he's been trained on this. I just don't think he was the person for this job, and his abject failure in this moment proves that. He effectively conceded his error when asked what he would have done differently had he known injured victims were in the classroom. Chief Arredondo responded to the committee, "I guess if I knew there was somebody in there, I would have. We probably would have rallied a little more to say, okay, someone is in there." Chief Arredondo personally tried all of one large set of keys brought to him, and when Sergeant Coronado cautioned him to stay clear in the hallway and the fatal funnel, Chief Arredondo responded, "Just tell them to effing wait." So while he's bumbling for keys that it's been shown he didn't need because the likelihood that this door was even locked is disputed, but it's one of those areas where, because we've been given so much differing information on the events of that day, and just the incident in general, it's honestly just really hard to take anything that these officers say to heart, because personally, I just don't believe them. And I feel like they're just trying to do a bunch of CYA. Uvalde CISD Police Chief Arredondo quickly arrived as the incident moved to school property and the law enforcement response evolved. This made him a natural person to assume command over an incident as it developed. But Chief Arredondo does not consider himself to have assumed incident command. He explained to the committee, "While you're in there, you don't title yourself. I know our policy states you're the incident commander. My approach and thought was responding as a police officer, and so I didn't title myself. But once I got in there and we took that fire, back then I realized we need some things. We gotta get in that door. We need an extraction tool. We need those keys." As far as I'm talking about the command part, the people that went in, there was a big group of them outside the door. I have no idea who they were and how they walked in or anything. I wasn't given that direction. You can always hope and pray that there's an incident command post outside. I just didn't have access to that. I didn't know anything about that. Again, it just kind of feels like a CYA. He's not wanting to kind of take any of the blame because in the active shooter plan, he was the person that was going to be in command. He was the person in command. People were looking to him and following his direction. He is the one that kept people from going in. He is the one that didn't really have the balls to check and see if that door was even really locked. It's just such a CYA move. And in this report, they also recognize that the misinformation reported to officers on the outside likely prevented some of them from taking a more assertive role. For example, many officers were told to stay out of the building because Chief Arredondo was inside a room with the attacker actively negotiating. Like, what a thing. What a thing to say, that Chief Arredondo is in the room negotiating with the attacker. So if that is the assumption that the majority of the officers that responded to this believe while they're on the outside of the school, it makes sense then why they were essentially trying to keep the parents away from that scene if they're under the belief that Chief Arredondo is verbally negotiating with the attacker, because that makes sense. They don't want there to be a hindrance to these negotiating efforts. But now, when we know that that was not true, it again is like, in this report, what are they thinking when they say that some of these officers should have been more up to the task to assume command? They were basically being given a bunch of lies of what was actually happening on the inside, which again is just like, why was there so many lies going on? Why is there so much convolution when it comes to just trying to basically understand the facts of the situation. Because when you look at the video that was leaked, which I will link in the description box below as well so that you can take a look, in that video you can see pretty much just like how cowardly so many of these officers were and how just inept Chief Arredondo was to meeting the moment. In total, 376 law enforcement officers responded to the tragedy at Robb Elementary School. 376 law enforcement officers. Now, we're being told, by the media it's 400, and that's close enough. This has just been such a devastating event. From the shooting itself and the loss of life, these little babies that their futures are completely gone, and these teachers that they shouldn't have been put in these situations at all. There's so much to be upset about. And I think it really does bring to question across the country the question of, are our police doing what they're doing to protect us? Or is it to protect the elite? Is it to protect property? Or is it to protect themselves? Because sadly, in this situation, at this shooting, there were officers that saved their own children first. No one was willing to take over command because that is not their job as officers. They are meant to follow orders. And they did. Orders that were built on lies. As I've said before, my heart goes out to the people of Uvalde, to every person that lost a loved one in this shooting. And I really do hope that we get more answers as time goes on. But unfortunately, we probably won't. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you liked this video. I know it was a bit of a long one, but there's just a lot of information here that I felt needed to be disseminated to all of you. So thank you again. Make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. And if you would like to see more of my work, my take on things, because I have a lot of opinions and I like to validate my opinions with facts and research, you can check out that work at endemictimes.com or on Substack. I will have a link to both of those down in the description box below. Thank you again for all your support. Stay safe, take care, and remember to be kind to each other.